Hey guys, welcome to week 7. I'm just going to go through some of the information from the PowerPoints that you have seen. You know what, actually I'm going to get out of this mode. Yeah, I think this will work pretty good. But I just want to go through the PowerPoints that are on Blackboard and talk you through some of them, give some background information, because sometimes PowerPoints don't always convey the best information when just looking at it. So much like you might have in class, we're just going to kind of talk through it. I am including some cervical spine into this PowerPoint to give you a little background on spine, some stuff we didn't talk through last week, but the shoulder's so complex and it's hard, and for the sake of this class and the amount of work that you should be putting into this class, we're not going to go into near as much detail, but I wanted to bring up a few topics that are important when we're considering shoulders. Right, we have many articulations if we're starting with the body, right? Because our extremities are important, but often injury and issues we have from our extremities come from our thorax. Come from some issues, whether it's core stability or lack of mobility on the thorax itself. And that's kind of where I'm going to focus when we talk about scapula. But the cervical vertebrae has many articulations, and they're very important, right? It gives our head proper posture. It allows for us to turn and see, right? Because our thoracic spine, even our lumbar spine, has motion, but not near the rotational motion, not near the availability of range of motion as our cervical spine, right? So it's very important. It's also its bony prominences and its structure is important to protect a lot of structures, right? Like the basis of many of our nerves of the upper extremity and throughout the rest of the body, and some of the gateways into our brain. So with that, many arteries and structures that are important for everyday life, right? Our breathing and continued heart monitoring and continued function of those structures. So when we're talking about the cervical spine, the articulations are very important. So throughout our spine, right, we see that our cervical spine looks much different. If I put the cursor over that vertebrae, has a much larger vertebral foramen because we have a lot more structures flowing through it. As we move down into our lower back, you have less and less structures having to flow through that area. But also we have different sections, such as like the transverse foramen, that helps with those vertebral arteries, and supplements a lot of the structures that go through. As we see, once we get lower and lower, those particular qualities go away. And you can also see how thick the cervical articulation and that area of the bone is different. It's much thinner, right? It doesn't hold as much weight, whereas deep in our lumbar, it's hard to see from this picture, but even in our thoracic, it gets a lot thicker, right? We have a lot more cushion for the more weight that we're bearing in those areas. Also, you notice the difference in our spinous process, right? So the cervical spine is going to have that bifurcation. It's a bit shorter. It allows for more movement, whereas we don't have as much extension in our thoracic spine. We're more in that area. We're more kyphotic, right? It leans a little bit forward in order for our lumbar then to be lordotic. So because of that spinous process is more inferior. It points down and it doesn't allow for, there's a bony block when you're trying to go to an extension. So it's important to look at these qualities in the spine to understand really what motion is coming from there. In the thoracic spine, we have the demifacets. So those demifacets are where our ribs are going to attach, and that articulation with the rib happens right there. So you can see the differences there. And then we see lumbar, right, has a lot of great qualities, but for the most part, we see a smaller spinous process because we're going to extension in this area, and a very thick main body of the joint or of the bone. So you can kind of see how all of this works in this picture, how they all fit together, what they look like. We see that upper and mid thoracic has the very angled inferior angling spinous process. And then we have a much thicker body in the lumbar spine. And then obviously the sacrum is a whole nother joint, a whole nother group of our spine. Very much goes more into, leads into that tail that we have evolved out of. But you can this picture is a good representation of all the differences and how they kind of change and how they progress into the next section. So I'm not going to play these videos for you. You can go back and look at them. You have the PowerPoints, but I just want to point out that the shoulder is a very complex joint, right? We have many articulations here. We have the AC joint plays a role, right? Our main joint, our glenohumeral joint, right, is what we focus on. But then we have the scapular thoracic joint. So the way the scapula articulates with the ribs and articulates with the rest of the body. So it's important to consider all of these joints in the motion of the shoulder. It's can be complex, it can be difficult, but by breaking it down, we can kind of see what the motions look like. And go ahead and look at this video, go back and see kind of how it moves, and they have the rotator cuff muscles on there. So like I said, you also have to consider the sternoclavicular, right? Because the clavicle does play a role in our articulation. Being able to raise our arm, it has to get out of the way and it has to move. And if that joint is stressed, or the joint kind of in front, in the anterior side, with the SC joint, if it is having issues, then you're going to have pain there and not be able to move the rest of the extremity. Then we have our AC, or acromioclavicular. Often see this, right? Our AC joint sprains. Football players that impact sports have the sprain to the ligament that holds that down. Then we have the glenohumeral, which is our ball and socket. It's our main mover, main motion area. But then also that scapulothoracic. So the big ball and socket joint, the one we think about the most, right? It has that articulation of the humeral head and the glenoid fossa of the scapula, meaning that the scapula contributes significantly to the motion of the shoulder. And I think it's often underappreciated, especially as we're learning about the shoulder. It's easier to look at it as, it's just the humerus, but they both play a huge role. When it comes to movement, a good picture, a cadaver picture there, you can see how shiny the head of the humerus is and how it fits into that socket. We have ligaments, tendons, muscles. The capsule plays a huge role in shoulder motion and our posture. The glenoid labrum all contribute to that stability, right? They work together to stabilize because it is a very unstable joint. It lacks a lot of stability because think about a golf ball on a tee. It's not this deep at all. It's very shallow, right? So that helps to promote motion, but also we lack any stability. So lots of mobility, not very much stability, but it is very commonly dislocated too. So we might have patients with some consistent subluxations, that chronic subluxation, and a lot of ligaments can be torn or can be affected by subluxation or dislocation. So I know you guys can't respond here, but some major movers, some major motion that's going on our shoulder, right? We have flexion, we have extension, we have abduction and adduction, so adduction back to our body. Then we have a cross body, right? Our cross body stretches is our horizontal adduction and horizontal abduction. And then we have internal and external range of motion, which often, again, gets overlooked, right? Its importance it's almost always in combination with something else. Think about throwing the ball, how many motions it takes to wind up and throw a ball. So be thinking of all that as we go through. Some of our major movers with our internal external rotation, flexion, those more dynamic motions is in our rotator cuff. So we have the supraspinatus, right? It's supra on the top. It comes through and runs. It's good to see in this front view picture. You can see where it comes and attaches to the humerus, the head of the humerus. And it goes under this subacromial space, which can be of great contention with our upper extremity athletes. But it flows through there, and there can be a lot of friction that happens if that space doesn't have enough area, right? Isn't completely clear. And then we also have our subscapularis, right, below on the lower side of the scapularis, or of the scapula. And this does quite a bit of movement when it comes to like our internal rotation, right? So we've got infraspinatus, which is also in the teres minor, which overlap each other on the posterior side and are really focused more on that, right, external rotation. It kind of pulls you into external rotation. So some other things that should be definitely considered in our diagnosis or understanding of the shoulder are our brachial plexus. We see we're not going to get into too much of the details, but it's very intricate levels of nerves that flow through and flow around the shoulder musculature and shoulder structures that can be affected when you have a shoulder injury. You guys will get into neural glides if you haven't already, and talk about how they all play a role, and how we can, and what pathologies can affect us up around the collarbone and our clavicle and in those soft areas where the trap is, right? A lot of us hold a lot of tension there, especially if you sit and you sit at your computer a lot. And so it's important that you understand the general anatomy and start to think about how these structures play into our muscular structures. We might see a stinger, right? If you've ever heard of that, especially with working football, we get a stinger by the stretch, right? And then nerves being affected, but also all of the musculature and other soft tissue affected with this. So it's important that you consider and start to look at what these nerves are and how they might affect the rest of